How's your day going? Today on Psychological Depth, we'll talk about the topic, these phrases women use when they don't want you to know their past. Let's tune in together. She didn't lie, exactly. Nothing she said was technically false. The words were accurate. The impression they created was not. You walked away from the conversation believing one thing, while the reality was something entirely different. The gap between what you understood and what actually happened. That gap was engineered not through fabrication, but through careful selection of which truths to emphasize and which to let fade into implication. Language can conceal while appearing to reveal. The statement that sounds like openness can function as misdirection. The phrase that seems like honest communication can serve as strategic management of what you're allowed to know. The skill isn't rare. Women learn it early. How to answer questions without answering them. How to address topics without actually addressing them. How to seem forthcoming while controlling information flow precisely. You're not supposed to ask about her past. The cultural messaging is clear. Such questions reveal insecurity. Such inquiries signal possessiveness. The modern man accepts her as she arrives, without examining what produced her. He trusts without verifying. He commits without investigating. Any deviation from this approach marks him as inadequate, too fragile to handle a woman with experience, too controlling to deserve one. This framing serves specific interests. The man who doesn't ask can't discover. The man who can't discover can't evaluate. The man who can't evaluate can't decide accurately. His decisions get made with incomplete information, while he's trained to believe that seeking complete information makes him the problem. The past matters, regardless of what you're told about whether it should matter. How someone has conducted themselves previously predicts how they'll conduct themselves subsequently. The patterns established don't vanish because a new relationship begins. The tendencies developed don't reset because different partner appears. History is the best evidence available about who someone actually is, rather than who they present themselves as being. She knows this, which is why information management becomes necessary. The history that might change your evaluation must be repackaged, minimized, or concealed entirely. Not through obvious deception that carries risk of exposure, through phrases that seem honest while accomplishing something other than honesty. The phrases function as code. Once you recognize them, you hear what's actually being communicated beneath the apparent communication. The recognition doesn't require accusation or confrontation. It just requires attention to what the words are doing versus what they seem to be doing. The number shouldn't matter arrives early in many relationships, sometimes before you've even asked the question. The preemptive deployment tells you something already. She's anticipating the topic. She's prepared a position. The position is that the inquiry itself is inappropriate, rather than that the answer is straightforward. Notice the structure. The statement doesn't address what the number is. It addresses whether you should care about what the number is. The conversation has been redirected from factual territory to philosophical territory. You're now debating whether inquiry is legitimate rather than receiving information the inquiry would produce. If the number genuinely didn't matter to her, if she felt comfortable with whatever history she carries, the easier response would be simple disclosure. State the number, let him evaluate. The move into philosophical debate signals that simple disclosure feels risky, that the number, whatever it is, might produce a response she wants to prevent. The preemptive argument protects against that response. The phrase contains implicit accusation. If you continue caring about the number after she's declared that caring is wrong, you've revealed your inadequacy. You've shown yourself to be the kind of man who shouldn't have access to her. Controlling, insecure, regressive. The accusation is delivered preemptively. Before you've done anything, you've been warned about the category you'll fall into if you proceed. Why should women be judged differently than men? Reframes the discussion around equality.
The question carries moral weight. Judging people differently based on gender is wrong. You probably agree with this principle in general. The agreement gets leveraged to prevent specific inquiry, but notice the sleight of hand. The question assumes that men face no judgment for their sexual histories. This assumption doesn't match reality. Men's histories get evaluated too, by women selecting partners, by social circles assessing character, by themselves when considering who they've become. The premise of the equality argument is fictional. Both genders face evaluation. The argument pretends otherwise to make her evaluation seem uniquely unfair. The equality framing also obscures relevant asymmetries. Men and women may face different consequences from identical behaviors. The patterns that signal one thing in men might signal something different in women, not because of arbitrary social judgment, but because of genuine differences in what those patterns tend to produce. The equality frame refuses to engage with these complications. It flattens everything into simple fairness argument that prevents nuanced discussion. I need my freedom, or I value my independence. Sounds like self-respect, autonomous, confident, the kind of woman who doesn't need a man to complete her. The presentation is attractive. Independence suggests strength rather than dependence. But examine when this phrase appears, often during discussions about exclusivity, about commitment, about defining what the relationship is and where it's going. The independence claim in these contexts communicates something specific. She's not ready to close other options. The freedom being valued is freedom to maintain alternatives while receiving the benefits of your investment. Independence in general is healthy. Independence invoked specifically when commitment approaches serves different purpose. The timing reveals function. She's not making philosophical statement about autonomy. She's declining to be exclusive while framing the declination as personal principle rather than preference to keep looking. I'm not the same person I was then. Positions whatever you might learn about her past as irrelevant to who she currently is. The person who did those things no longer exists. The person before you has grown beyond her history. Evaluating her based on that history means evaluating someone who's already transformed into someone else. The claim has intuitive appeal. People do grow, they do change. The person at 30 differs from the person at 20. Acknowledging change seems both accurate and generous, the kind of flexibility mature evaluation requires. But transformation has limits. Core patterns tend to persist. The woman who approached relationships one way for years has established tendencies that don't evaporate through declaration that she's now different. The behavior she defaults to, the patterns she falls into under stress, the preferences that shaped past choices, these don't vanish because a new identity has been announced. Additionally, notice when transformation gets claimed versus when it doesn't. The selective application reveals motivation. She's transformed from the past that might trouble you. She's probably not transformed from the accomplishments or positive traits that would recommend her. The transformation occurs precisely around what she'd prefer you not to weight heavily. The precision isn't coincidental. That was just a phase, minimizes whatever period she'd prefer you not to examine closely. The behavior wasn't who she really is. The choices weren't reflective of her actual character. The phase was aberration, temporary departure from her true self that has since been left behind entirely. Phases do exist, periods where someone experiments before settling into different patterns, but the phrase often describes extended periods that shaped who she became, rather than brief departures that left no trace. A phase of several years isn't really a phase, it's a significant portion of adult life whose influence can't be dismissed through labeling. The phase framing also avoids responsibility. Phases happen to people. They're weather passing through rather than choices being made. The agency that selected those experiences, that continued them, that only stopped when new incentives appeared. This agency gets concealed by language suggesting she was temporarily inhabited by someone else who made choices she wouldn't have made. Everyone has a past universalizes her specific history.
You have a past too. Everyone does. Therefore, her past can't be examined specifically because everyone's past would need equal examination, which would be impossible and absurd. The argument wins through making her situation seem identical to all situations, but not all pasts are equivalent. The phrase equates histories that differ substantially. Some pasts include minimal complexity that requires minimal processing. Other pasts include patterns that predict significant future behavior. Pretending these are identical, that past is one undifferentiated category, prevents evaluation that different paths might warrant differently. The phrase also preempts comparison. If everyone has a past, your past exists too,
Any inquiry into hers invites inquiry into yours. Maybe your past contains things you'd prefer unexamined. The implied mutuality creates pressure to drop the subject entirely rather than risk reciprocal examination. I've learned so much about myself reframes history as education. The experiences weren't just experiences, they were growth opportunities. She entered them one person and emerged another, wiser, more self-aware, better equipped for real partnership than she would have been without them. The growth narrative is seductive. It positions everything as progress. No experience was mistake or misadventure. All were necessary steps toward becoming who she now is. The curriculum she followed was precisely what she needed. The evaluation should consider outcomes rather than process, but growth doesn't automatically accompany experience. People can go through extensive experience and learn nothing. They can repeat patterns without gaining wisdom about those patterns. The claim of learning is claim, not evidence. The learning would need to be demonstrated rather than simply declared. What would evidence of learning look like? Changed behavior, different patterns, choices that reflect what the experience supposedly taught. In the absence of such evidence, the growth narrative might be rationalization dressed as development, story that makes history more palatable without representing genuine transformation. I don't want to be defined by my past sounds reasonable. No one wants reduction to their history. Everyone wants to be seen as more than accumulated choices. The preference for holistic evaluation over narrow focus seems fair, but the phrase often appears specifically when the past contains things that would affect definition. The woman whose past is unremarkable rarely needs to request not being defined by it. The request signals that definition might change if the past were actually examined. The preemptive framing is protective rather than principled. Definition by past isn't the only alternative to ignoring past. The past can be known, understood, weighted appropriately, and integrated into evaluation that also includes present and future. The choice isn't between reduction to history and dismissal of history. It's between complete picture and incomplete picture. She's requesting the incomplete one. That was before I knew what I wanted, positions earlier choices as confused rather than revealing. She didn't know herself yet. The experiences were experiments in search of clarity. Now that clarity has arrived, those experiments become irrelevant to understanding who she is. The framing assumes she now knows what she wants. The assumption might be correct. It might not. Someone who didn't know what they wanted through multiple years of adulthood might still not know. The claim of newfound clarity could be genuine insight or could be optimistic self-assessment unconfirmed by subsequent behavior. Examine what changed. Did circumstances change her options? Did age change the attention she received? Did consequences from previous choices create pressure toward different choices? The knowing what I want narrative might describe internal transformation or might describe external conditions that made previous patterns unsustainable. I was different when I was younger leverages the universal experience of being different when younger. Everyone was different. Everyone has distance from earlier versions of themselves. The observation is true and also irrelevant to whether earlier patterns predict current tendencies. The phrase invites you to recall your own younger self. Maybe you did things you wouldn't do now. Maybe you understand how people change. The identification with her experience is supposed to generate sympathy that prevents evaluation. Your own younger self gets recruited as argument against examining her younger self. But the phrase often appears specifically when the past contains things that would affect definition.
The woman whose past is unremarkable rarely needs to request not being defined by it. The request signals that definition might change if the past were actually examined. The preemptive framing is protective rather than principled. Definition by past isn't the only alternative to ignoring past. The past can be known, understood, weighted appropriately, and integrated into evaluation that also includes present and future. The choice isn't between reduction to history and dismissal of history. It's between complete picture and incomplete picture. She's requesting the incomplete one. That was before I knew what I wanted, positions earlier choices as confused rather than revealing. She didn't know herself yet. The experiences were experiments in search of clarity. Now that clarity has arrived, those experiments become irrelevant to understanding who she is.
The framing assumes she now knows what she wants. The assumption might be correct, it might not. Someone who didn't know what they wanted through multiple years of adulthood might still not know. The claim of newfound clarity could be genuine insight or could be optimistic self-assessment unconfirmed by subsequent behavior. Examine what changed. Did circumstances change her options? Did age change the attention she received? Did consequences from previous choices create pressure toward different choices? The bad place framing prevents these questions because the framing already positions her as victim rather than agent. You wouldn't understand shuts down inquiry entirely. The experiences she had exist in a category or comprehension can't reach. Asking further is pointless because understanding is impossible. The conversation ends with her history protected by declared incomprehensibility. The phrase implies that understanding requires shared experience. Only someone who's lived what she lived could evaluate it properly. You haven't lived it, therefore your evaluation is disqualified before it begins. The expertise required to assess her history is expertise only she possesses. But understanding doesn't require identical experience. People understand things they haven't lived constantly. The claim that understanding is impossible serves to prevent the attempt. If you accept that you can't understand, you stop trying to understand. The history remains unexamined because examination was defined as impossible. The past is the past sounds philosophical, profound even. The statement seems to contain wisdom about living in the present rather than dwelling on what can't be changed. The man who focuses on past rather than present misses what's actually available.
The phrase borrows from genuine wisdom traditions while serving different purpose. Legitimate teachings about not dwelling in past address psychological health, not letting previous suffering dominate current experience. The deployment here repurposes that wisdom to prevent evaluation that might inform decisions. Not dwelling and not knowing are different things. The phrase conflates them. The past being the past doesn't mean the past is irrelevant. The past produced the present. The past predicts the future. What happened before determines patterns that continue. Philosophical observation about time doesn't change the predictive relationship between history and behavior. The patterns in these phrases become visible with attention. Each phrase accomplishes similar function through different vocabulary. Each redirects away from direct discussion of history toward debate about whether discussion is appropriate. Each positions your interest as the problem rather than her history as the topic. The consistency reveals strategy. These aren't random responses, they're learned approaches to a recurring situation. The situation being someone wants information that might change their evaluation. The approaches prevent that information from being provided or from being weighted if somehow discovered. Recognition doesn't require confrontation. You needn't challenge the phrase when you hear it. The recognition is for your benefit, to understand what's happening in the conversation, to notice when information management is occurring rather than information sharing. What you do with the recognition is a separate decision. Some men decide that whatever history exists doesn't matter to them. They accept the person before them regardless of what came before. This choice is available. When made with eyes open, it's valid choice. Other men decide that history matters enough that incomplete information prevents commitment. They decline to bind themselves to unknowns that might significantly affect outcomes. This choice is also available. It's not insecurity or control, it's recognition that major decisions deserve major information. The phrases don't necessarily indicate specific histories. Someone might use these phrases while having history that wouldn't concern you at all. The phrases indicate discomfort with the topic rather than necessarily indicating troubling content. But discomfort itself is information. Someone comfortable with their history doesn't need elaborate redirects. The simple answer suffices. The phrases appear when simple answers feel insufficient, when the history seems to require management rather than disclosure. The observation applies to early dating particularly, when histories are unfamiliar, when each person is deciding whether to invest further, when the information gathered now shapes commitments that might last decades. The stakes justify attention that casual interaction wouldn't require. Later in relationships, histories have usually been absorbed. The information exists whether discussed directly or inferred over time.
The phrases matter less when you've had years to observe who someone actually is. They matter most when you're deciding whether to begin something that might bind you indefinitely. Some women are straightforward. They answer questions directly. They don't employ redirects because they don't need redirects. Whatever their history, they're comfortable enough with it to discuss openly. The absence of elaborate phrases tells you something. The presence of them tells you something else. Attending to patterns extends beyond these specific phrases. Communication style reveals itself across many topics. The person who manages information about history will likely manage information about other things. The patterns are consistent because they emerge from consistent underlying orientation. Someone oriented toward transparency communicates differently than someone oriented toward information control. The distinction reveals itself through countless small observations. The specific phrases discussed here are symptoms of larger pattern rather than isolated phenomena. Making informed decisions requires accurate information.
The relationship entered with false understanding rests on unstable foundation. Whatever emerges later emerges into context that began with deception. The patterns that she hid remain her patterns. The information she managed doesn't stop being relevant because it was successfully managed. The man who notices what's happening can choose his response. He might ask directly despite the redirect. I understand you feel it shouldn't matter, but it matters to me and I'd like to know. The directness cuts through the framing. Either she answers or her refusal to answer becomes itself an answer. He might accept that information won't be forthcoming and proceed anyway knowing he doesn't know, building what he builds with awareness that foundation includes unknown elements. The choice is still informed. He's informed that he's not informed. He might decline to proceed into deeper involvement. The information management itself signals something he doesn't want to navigate. The relationship that requires this level of concealment from the beginning doesn't seem promising for the honesty long-term partnership requires. Each response is legitimate. What's not legitimate is being deceived without recognizing that deception is occurring. The man who hears the phrases without understanding their function remains at disadvantage. The man who understands what's happening can respond from a position of accurate awareness. The cultural framing that discourages these questions serves particular interests. Those interests aren't yours. The framework that calls inquiry insecure protects one party's informational advantage at the other party's expense. Accepting the framework means accepting the disadvantage. Reasonable adults can discuss their histories. Histories that include complexity are still discussable. The conversations might be difficult, they might reveal things either party would prefer to leave unexamined, but the difficulty doesn't justify avoidance when the information shapes major decisions. She's allowed to have boundaries, to decline to discuss things she finds too painful or too private. Boundaries are legitimate, but boundary establishment and information management differ. The boundary says, "This is territory I don't discuss." The phrases we've examined say, "This territory doesn't exist or shouldn't matter or can't be understood." Different communications entirely. Boundaries you can respect while recognizing them as boundaries. You can accept that certain topics are off limits while knowing that they're off limits. You can decide whether the limits work for you while having accurate understanding of what's happening. The phrases prevent that accurate understanding. They disguise information management is something else. They make you feel that something's wrong with your inquiry rather than that something's being hidden from your inquiry. The confusion they create is the confusion they're designed to create. Long-term relationships built on concealment carry specific risks. The concealed information doesn't disappear. It might emerge through other channels, friends who knew her then, social media archaeology, her own disclosure during conflict. When the relationship provides less incentive for concealment, when it emerges, you face double impact: the information itself, whatever it is, and the recognition that she managed it strategically rather than sharing it openly. The second impact sometimes exceeds the first. The history might be processable. The deception about the history raises different questions. Better to know early. Better to face whatever difficulties honest discussion produces before commitments have been made. The difficult conversation before marriage is awkward. The discovery after marriage is devastating. The sequence matters. Asking doesn't mean demanding. Asking means inquiring. Her response, whether direct, evasive, or deflecting, gives you information regardless of what she actually says. The how of her response tells you things even when the what of her response tells you nothing. Some topics take time to discuss. Histories that include trauma genuinely need careful handling. The man who asks deserves to ask. He doesn't deserve immediate, complete disclosure of things that are genuinely difficult to discuss. The conversation can develop over time as trust builds, but time and evasion differ. The conversation that develops over time looks different from the conversation that never happens because it's always being redirected. Patience differs from gullibility. Waiting for appropriate moment differs from accepting that appropriate moment will never arrive. What would actually addressing the topic look like? I've had experiences that were formative for me. Some of them weren't choices I'm proud of. Here's generally what happened and how I think about it now. Direct, honest, taking ownership rather than deflecting through philosophy about whether the discussion should occur. The woman who can discuss her past this way is showing you something important. Not that her history is clean, it might include complexity, but that she's processed it enough to discuss it, that she doesn't need elaborate management strategies, that she trusts you with the information rather than protecting herself from your evaluation. The relationship that can contain this conversation contains the capacity for difficult conversations. Generally, the willingness to be known fully suggests willingness to know you fully. Mutuality becomes possible when concealment isn't operating. Conversely, the relationship that can't contain this conversation may struggle with other difficult conversations. The management strategies employed here might appear elsewhere. The orientation toward information control rather than disclosure might characterize her approach to problems. Generally, these patterns matter because they predict, not with certainty, predictions aren't guarantees, but with enough reliability to inform decisions. The woman who manages information about her past might manage information about other things. The pattern isn't specific to this topic. Evaluating communication patterns is legitimate relationship work, not paranoid interrogation, not insecure obsession. Simple attention to how someone engages with topics that matter to you. The attention informs. The information serves decisions that determine years of your life. The phrases she uses tell you things, not necessarily about her history directly, about her relationship to her history, about her orientation toward the discussion, about whether she's sharing or managing. The phrases are data points in evaluation that produces better decisions. Know what you're hearing when you hear these phrases. Know what's being communicated beneath the surface of what seems to be communicated. The difference determines what you know when you need to know it. She's telling you something whether she means to or not. Listen to what she's actually communicating rather than what she seems to be communicating. The difference determines what you know when you need to know it.